pilots and passengers. There are many convicted cases of satanic ritual abuse, and we have only explored some in the first video on this dark reality for likely thousands of children and vulnerable adults around the world. I've previously stated that satanic ritual abuse does unfortunately exist, and that there are many reports of twisted and despicable sexual, emotional and physical abuse which has taken place and is taking place behind closed doors. I don't care how many times I have to repeat this or shout into what feels like a void, but satanic ritual abuse is very real. It's a phenomenon that the public and mainstream media hate to acknowledge, but when they do, it's either sensationalised or dismissed. Let me remind you, satanic ritual abuse is not a page turner. The testimonies of victims are not there for your entertainment, and they certainly should not be dismissed. Before we get into the video, I'd like to say that if you want to help support the channel, please subscribe to Dare to Fly to help expose the corruption carried out by these elites, and follow us on social media. Now, let's fly into today's video. In August 1989, Peter McKenzie was sentenced at St Albans Crown Court to 15 years in prison for the sadistic sexual abuse and rapes of 13 young girls. Peter was found guilty of 4 rapes and other sexual assaults against the young girls, where some of the victims were as young as 6. McKenzie told his victims that he was Asmodeus, a prince of demons, or the king of demons in Jewish law, which is a historic satanic name associated with 19th century French Satanism. The victims were forced to recite satanic prayers dedicated to him. Girls as young as 6 and 7 were raped by McKenzie and were promised magic powers and were told that they would become witches in his magic circle if they had sex with him. Reginald Harris raped a 15-year-old girl and her younger sister, telling the poor victims that he was a satanic high priest, terrifying them into submission through satanic rituals. He had even drawn up a Satanist Coven contract of marriage to the 15-year-old girl. On the 8th of August 1990, Reginald Harris was convicted at Worcester Crown Court after pleading guilty to the charges against him. This theme of marriage to Satan, or satanic marriage, continues to crop up. There's a theme here, a pattern. Just look at the testimonies of Teresa and Jeanette Archer, who both said they were subjected to contracts with Lucifer. Teresa mentioned being forced to marry the devil at a dark wedding ceremony.
They used to marry the kids to Lucifer so that we were part of him, you know, we were his.
Did that include you? Were you married to the devil?
Yeah. We used to be dressed up in the cloak, and it was just like a marriage in a church, but different words, you know.
On the 3rd of July 1992, a self-proclaimed Satanist was sentenced at Liverpool Crown Court to 12 years in prison for the sexual abuse of his own niece. The victim was raped up to 3 times a week, from the age of 10 up until she was 12 years old. Police discovered a black magic room where the 57-year-old had an altar and other ritual equipment, including occult items. The Satanist niece became pregnant at the age of 12, where he forced her to give birth in the ritual room and terrified her into taking part in satanic rituals. If the victim ever spoke out about the abuse, her uncle threatened to kill her pets or rape her younger sister. The victim was forced to watch as her uncle drowned one of her pets and snapped the neck of another. In court, Judge Dennis Clark told the Satanist, "Your fascination with the occult or devil worship played a part in impelling you towards the evil behaviour." On the 11th of March 2011, 48-year-old Colin Batley was sentenced at Swansea Crown Court to a minimum of 11 years in prison for 35 offences, including 11 rapes and the abuse of children. Colin was the leader of a satanic sex cult in Kidwelly, where himself and a group of 3 women, including his wife, ritually abused children and adults, with some children as young as 11 being subjected to horrific sexual and physical abuse. The cult originated in London and was moved to Wales in the 1990s by Colin, where much of the abuse took place in a cul-de-sac. The abuse was described as organised and systematic, and victims described how occult writings, rituals and practices were used to brainwash them and justify the abuse. The Kidwelly cult was inspired by the works of occultist Aleister Crowley, as the cult referred to Crowley's The Book of Law when acting out the rituals and the abuse. Crowley's book promotes prostitution and sex magic. The women in the cult, which was known as the Church, had various ancient Egyptian items and idolatry in their homes, and even had the Eye of Horus tattooed on their arms as a symbol of protection. This referenced Crowley's worship of the Egyptian god Horus, the falcon deity, with the Eye of Horus being an incredibly important symbol in mythology, as it is believed to symbolise power and protection. One victim said that she was passed around to have sex with strangers during satanic parties, where members of the cult were dressed in hooded robes and referred to Batley as the High Priest. Another victim described how Batley told her that she would go to the abyss if she did not have sex with him. The cult used intimidation, threats of violence and occultism to force their victims to submit to sexual abuse and take part in satanic rituals. A schoolgirl, now an adult, said that she was forced to join the cult out of fear for her life. Batley told her that if she refused to take part in an elaborate initiation ceremony, a cult assassin would come and kill her. This ceremony would start with a lecture on the occult, which resulted in being raped by Batley. She was also forced to visit Batley's home regularly to have sex with him, and was taken to satanic sex parties where she was forced to have sex with strangers. The then schoolgirl said that all of the satanic cult members had an Eye of Horus tattoo, as previously mentioned. It was described how the cult had a satanic altar which was used during rituals. At one of these altars there was a goblet of red wine, salted bread and an incense burner. After using the altar, the cult members would then disrobe and have sex with one another. Another victim, a boy, who is now also an adult, said that he was repeatedly abused by Batley as a child. Batley tried to prevent a young woman from aborting a baby which he believed he fathered, so it could be raised as a child of the occult. Batley filmed the abuse which took place, including the cult members having sex with children. However, it is believed that all of the recorded material was destroyed before Colin's arrest, as he was tipped off by friends in London about the impending raid on his home 2 days before it occurred. Colin Batley was described as being active as a molester and rapist of children and adults for more than 30 years, where he used his position as a cult leader to abuse young girls and boys. He was found guilty of offences including 11 rapes, 3 indecent assaults, causing prostitution for personal gain, causing a child to have sex, and inciting a child to have sex. Batley's right-hand woman, Jacqueline Marling, 42, was sentenced to 12 years in prison, whilst Elaine Batley was jailed for 8 years. Elaine, Batley's wife, was found guilty of 3 counts of indecency with a child and 1 count of sexual activity with a child. Marling was found guilty of offences including 1 count of aiding and abetting rape, 1 count of causing prostitution for gain, and another count of inciting a child to engage in sex. She was also found guilty of 3 separate counts of indecency with a child. Shelley Miller, who was described in court as Batley's sex slave, was jailed for 5 years. Miller was found guilty of indecency with a child and inciting a child to engage in sex. A 70-year-old man called Vincent Barden of Bedfordshire, who was not a member of the Satanic cult, was sentenced to 3 years in prison for the sexual assault of an underage girl. In court, Judge Thomas told Batley, "You formed a community within a community. You were described as evil. That, in my view, is an entirely accurate statement of your character. It is likely you have dedicated your life since you were 12 years old to satisfying your sexual urges by whatever means at your disposal. Batley's public protection sentence with an 11-year minimum recommendation means that he will likely never set foot out of prison again. He would only be eligible to apply for parole once it was determined that he was no longer seen as a threat to the public. And a major part of that process includes admitting guilt, something which Batley denied throughout the trial. One of Batley's neighbours said, Batley and one of his friends used to have a van calling regularly with a consignment of contraband tobacco and, we think, pornography. They used to head off to France on fortnightly trips and sometimes were gone for as long as 6 weeks. It makes you wonder if part of their cult activity was going on there too. A statement by the victims was read out in court. It said, "We are generally pleased with the sentencing today. It's been a nightmare journey for each one of us, but we hope this can be a start of a new beginning. We've experienced the worst that life can throw at us, and all we want to do is move forward with our lives. We would like to take this opportunity to say to anyone else who may have experienced anything like what we have, to dig deep and find the courage to report it, whether to a family member, friend or the police. Don't be afraid and don't suffer alone." In December 2012, 2 members of a witches' coven based in St Ives, Cornwall, were convicted at Truro Crown Court for the sadistic and ritualistic sexual abuse of young girls. Jack Kemp, 69, was sentenced to 14 years, and Peter Petrowski, 72, was jailed for 18 years for the abuse and assaults of children dating back to the 1970s. The court told how some of the victims were believed to be as young as 3 years old. Petrowski was convicted for offences including 1 count of rape, 1 count of aiding and abetting an attempt to rape, and 1 count of indecent assault. Kemp was sentenced for offences including indecent assault and indecency with a child, but was found not guilty of 4 other offences. However, he was also found guilty of more recent assaults, which were not connected to Petrowski. Kemp and Petrowski wore ceremonial robes and had pagan and satanic paraphernalia when they abused young girls in Cornwall during the 1970s. There were other members of the Coven, including many women, who referred to Kemp as the High Priest of the White Witches Coven. The Coven met in an undisclosed location in St Ives, where sick and twisted abuse was carried out, and was videoed and documented by Kemp. Victims described in court how they were threatened and tormented with ritual daggers. Jack Kemp took part in the abuse with his friends Peter Solheim, whose mutilated body was later found floating off the lizard, and Stan Pirrie, a notorious paedophile responsible for horrific sexual abuse in the 2000s, who later died in jail. Peter Solheim was hated by his neighbours before his murder and was repeatedly reported to the police as being a suspected paedophile. Following his murder, police discovered hardcore pornography and an occult laboratory in the attic of his home. Recipes for potions on abusing women and casting spells were present, including dozens of books on witchcraft and the occult. A witness described how rituals and ceremonies were carried out in a variety of locations, including gardens, in the woods and on beaches. Both of the abusers were 2 of the surviving members of what was believed to be a paedophile ring, which operated in Falmouth in the 1970s and 80s with a group of other members. Throughout the trial, Kemp denied any involvement and said that he was the victim of a bizarre conspiracy, whilst the judge said he was satisfied that you have both had a lifelong interest in young female children. In court, victims described how they were abused before being given sweets and money to stay quiet and not tell anyone about what was going on. Judge Cottle said, "The scars left on 2 victims are so obvious that it would seem extremely unlikely that either of them have any real prospect of recovery." Detective Constable Rick Milburn said, "It was truly horrific abuse, the worst my officers and myself have ever seen. It was truly distressing for everyone involved. The only way to describe what these victims have been through is that it has destroyed their lives." These cases are just the tip of the iceberg. Think of all of the reports and investigations into satanic ritual abuse which never saw a courtroom. The victims and witnesses who were never given a chance to seek justice. Accepting and realising that this abuse exists in society is difficult. No one wants to hear that there are children and vulnerable adults being severely abused, but continuing to remain ignorant and refusing to acknowledge that there are people in this world capable of carrying out such abuse. That only perpetuates the abuse. It allows the abusers to continue their crimes without ever being held accountable for the devastating impact they have had and are having on human lives. I will continue to speak out and advocate for justice on behalf of victims and survivors. I don't care about the hate, being called crazy or being ridiculed. Say whatever you like about me. It doesn't bother me and I couldn't care less. But don't target the victims. I will not stand for that. If you want help in the fight against corruption and want to support this channel, then subscribe to Dare to Fly today and get ready to take flight. United we stand, divided we fall. And as always, fly high, fear less.